Hello. Well, yeah, I'm not in the government anymore. It's like you're not in Kansas anymore. My name is Richard C. Cook. I put the C in there because when I went to get a website, Richard Cook was taken by this real estate broker. So now I'm Richard C. Cook, so forgive that. It's not as formal as it seems. I'm really grateful to Dominican University. I had no idea what a beautiful, lovely place this is, and it really is, and the Public Banking Institute. And Ellen has just ridden a tremendous wave of feeling and enlightenment that's been going on in this country and the world in a very short time. Because in 2008, when we met, there was nowhere near the level of knowledge and interest in coming together that we're seeing today. So a tremendous thing is going on. I worked for 32 years in Washington, D.C. I worked for the Food and Drug Administration, yes, the Carter White House, NASA, and the U.S. Treasury Department, and I was in Treasury for over 20 years. But as Ellen indicated, I'm also a lifelong student of meditation and spirituality, and that has led me to see things much differently from your typical bureaucratic perspective. At least I think it has. I'm the author of 4 books. My first one was called In the Footsteps of the Yogi, which was about a guru from India that I worked and traveled with during my vacations from work at the government for 7 years. When I retired from the government in 2007, I published a book called Challenger Revealed, about my days as a whistleblower following the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. You can read about that on my website. Then, as I was sitting in my small apartment where I was then living in College Park, Maryland, I was looking around for what to do next, so I began to write articles on the growing financial crisis, and along with a few others, predicted the crash of 2008. Because the coming of that crash was obvious to me and others, some others, due to the unsustainable debt-to-equity ratios in the economy. And people who listened then and got out of the stock market did, in fact, save a lot of money, but most people did not. And many people who'd been led to believe that if they bought all these IRAs and shifted their government retirement over to the stock market and so on, they would do great, lost a huge amount of their savings. Because when debt reaches a critical point, which it has done repeatedly during the boom-bust cycles of past years, a crash is inevitable. In the 80s, we had the merger-acquisition bubble. Then we had the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, a gold bubble, which is tanking, the stock market bubble. And today, it's not due to increasing values of what is being produced. It's a bubble. And now they want to start a new housing bubble. The result is always the same. And I think Bill Still made it very clear in his presentation that our economy has been based on the inflation and deflation of bubbles for a generation. There has been very little actual, real, tangible growth in the value of our producing economy since the 1970s, with devastating effects on the people who work for a living. So, having written all these articles, in 2009 I published a book which is a compilation. It's entitled, We Hold These Truths, and you know where that came from. We Hold These Truths, the Hope of Monetary Reform. And then I kind of got out of that field for a while. My wife, Karen, and I, who I married in 2008, left the D.C. area, and we now live and teach meditation and spirituality out in the mountains in Roanoke, Virginia. We headed for the hills, and we're very happy there. And a few months ago, I published my most recent book, which Ellen mentioned. It's called Return of the Eons, The Planetary Spiritual Ascension. But it does have a chapter on my monetary ideas and proposals entitled Monetary Metaphysics. So here it is. I brought a couple signed copies with me this weekend if you want to pick up a copy. And in my book, I make note of the extremely perilous condition of the United States at present due to the fact that it has fallen under the almost complete control of a financial cartel that you could justifiably call a financial mafia. And I use that term in my book, and I use it very advisedly, and I can tell you a lot more about what that means to me, which is headquartered in Wall Street. This cartel controls all aspects of economic life in the U.S. today, along with most of our politics and much of our media and culture, and is obviously part of an international financial conglomerate. The peace and sanity of the world are in great peril today, especially with the continuing potential of world war between East and West, which has monetary roots, just as World War I and World War II had monetary roots. And again, Bill and others and myself have written about this. I think the growth of spirituality in the world today, which is reflected by your presence in a conference like this, has a splendid promise for mankind. I call it a spiritual ascension. But on the way to getting there, we are facing disasters of tremendous proportions unless we are able to do something about it. So, as we face these prospects, it is essential for people like everybody in this room and many others behind the leadership of organizations like the Public Banking Institute to hone our thinking about the world that we wish to create, even as things are falling apart around us. And as we prepare for a future where the old structures will have collapsed, and they are collapsing, they're unsustainable. The earth cannot survive the continuation of existing financial and political structures. They will pass away. So we have to envision what we put in place to replace all that. Public banking is an unbelievably important topic, and it's a very broad one. It includes a multitude of reforms and a great variety of approaches, but they all derive from the proper definition of money and credit as a public utility, which Ellen spoke to when she opened this conference. It's also the title of my 6-part video series you can find on YouTube, and it's also accessible through the Public Banking Institute website, Credit as a Public Utility. It is the duty of any government to provide a circulating medium of exchange for the movement of trade and the facilitation of exchange of labor. It's a basic duty of collective life to provide a circulating medium of exchange. This is only strange to people because we've been so brainwashed into believing that the only way money can or should be created is through lending from private banks under the umbrella of a central bank like the Federal Reserve System. But the difference between private and public control of money and banking is like night and day. Private control of money creation is the way the financial elite maintains control of the world that they are destroying daily through greed, exploitation, violence, and enslavement of humanity. Public control of money is a major part of our hope for a future of ecological sanity whereby humanity might exist as a human family. Thank you. I remember that beautiful book from the 1960s, The Human Family? Unforgettable impact. And also as friends of our Mother, the Earth. So, the Federal Reserve System, while it is literally owned as a matter of law by its private banking members, is chartered by Congress. And again, Bill still shows us how that happened, creature from Jekyll Island. But it was a government charter proving that our system of government does implicitly recognize that the monetary power is sovereign to we the people, to the people of the nation, even though that sovereignty has been given away or perhaps stolen. In fact, much of American history can be analyzed as a struggle between private and public control of money creation. Here again, Ellen and Bill are leading the way to explain the history of money control. In colonial days, our legislatures, the colonial legislatures, exerted their sovereignty by creating a number of regional currencies, including those of the Pennsylvania Land Bank. We had Virginia tobacco currencies and others. In 1764, though, the British Parliament, controlled by the big bankers, abolished any further issuances in these colonies, which led to an economic depression. Benjamin Franklin recognized this as the prime cause of the Revolutionary War, though our historians, largely drawn from the Eastern financial and academic elite, have conveniently ignored this part of our history. The Articles of Confederation, under which the Revolutionary War was fought, extended to the Continental Congress the right to create money through the issuance of what were then called bills of credit. Under this provision, a continental currency was spent into existence, which was an entirely legitimate system, not based on any kind of debt, which, despite the inflation in that currency, sustained the American war effort until France entered the conflict with gold. The value of the continental currency, which has been much aligned by official academia, was actually destroyed to a significant extent by British counterfeiting. They set up printing presses on ships in New York Harbor, printed fake continental currency, so everybody became frightened to take it. France came in and saved the day financially. But by the time the U.S. Constitution was ratified, the bankers had begun a renewed effort to take over this country. The chief instigator was Alexander Hamilton, in many other respects a great hero of the Revolutionary War, but he had become the mastermind of the New York banking cabal, closely allied with the banks of Great Britain. They prevented bills of credit from appearing in the new Constitution, except, you know where it did appear. It appeared as a prohibition against the states from issuing bills of credit. The central government was given the power to tax, to incur debt, and again, Bill spoke to that, and to mint coin, but this was really to mint coin for private parties, not to establish a national printed currency. However, the Constitution also gave the government the power to regulate interstate commerce. Under the implied powers doctrine, this in itself provides the basis for a national monetary system. Again, this point has been ignored by academia. However, in our Constitution, the role of the federal government was extremely ambiguous, which allowed Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, to use the implied powers doctrine to create the first Bank of the United States, which was an imitation of the Bank of England. The first bank was to be capitalized by U.S. government debt, which is very similar to the system we have today. Remember that principle. U.S. government debt, Treasury bonds, became the capital of the first Bank of the United States, and they were bought up in their majority by foreign bankers. But Jefferson, Madison, and others saw what Hamilton was up to. After Jefferson was elected president through what was then called the Revolution of 1800, the first bank was downgraded and then eliminated. Its charter was not renewed. Later, the second bank reared its head, but it was marginalized by President Andrew Jackson until its charter expired. Until the Civil War, the United States developed without a central bank. Banking was done by a network of private and state-owned banks, later derided as wildcat banks, but which in fact served our nation extremely well. And these existed side by side with capital markets that effectively funded projects like the building of the Erie Canal, the early railroads, and many other infrastructure projects. But then came the great catastrophe of the Civil War. Congress, with President Abraham Lincoln's cooperation, literally saved the nation through the printing and issuance of greenbacks, which were spent by the government directly into circulation as payment for wartime expenses. The greenbacks were a tremendous innovation, but were also denigrated by historians. But actually, Greenbacks helped give us an effective circulating currency for several decades. They were even being used into the 20th century. Maybe you have some in your attic or inside the walls of your house like my grandfather used to keep his money. But during the Civil War, the banks had been able to stage a major coup d'etat by the adoption in Congress of the new national banking system under the National Banking Act of 1863. While there was no central bank yet, the state and local bank currencies were effectively outlawed, with national banks again becoming, under law, collateralized by federal government debt, just as were the first and second banks of the United States. Now, as we all know, the central bank came roaring back into existence in 1913, when the Federal Reserve System was created, and the government surrendered its sovereignty over money to the private banking system that owns the Federal Reserve. I am going to get to the topic of my speech before I'm done, the Gaia Plan. But one thing leads to another, you know. But the power struggle continued. The bankers took us into World War I on the side of Great Britain, home of the Bank of England. And then they did give us some economic boom times until the crash of 1927, which was caused by a contraction of the currency, emanating originally from Great Britain. President Franklin Roosevelt gradually took over de facto control of the banking system, including the Federal Reserve, through his appointment of Mariner Eccles, one of his close allies, as chairman. The New Deal and the post-World War II economic boom were created by low interest rates and federal control of the banking system, in addition to wartime consumer savings. And of course, the fact that our competitors, Germany and other nations, had been defeated in war and had collapsed. But this too began to change in the 1950s while Dwight Eisenhower was president. And there was actually an agreement in 1953 between the U.S. Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve System, now again under private banking control, to allow the gradual raising of interest rates. And this went on all through the 1950s and 1960s. But the great turning point, in my opinion, was the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in 1963. It is not sufficiently recognized the extent to which Kennedy was viewed as an enemy by Wall Street and the banking industry. I refer you to a tremendous book on the subject entitled Battling Wall Street, The Kennedy Presidency, by Professor Donald Gibson of the University of Pittsburgh. To me, it was a life-changing read. I'll give you the title again, Battling Wall Street, The Kennedy Presidency, Professor Donald Gibson, University of Pittsburgh. With Kennedy out of the way, the power of the bankers continued to grow. The inflation of the oil prices of the 70s was engineered by the bankers, as was Nixon's abandonment of the gold peg, as was the creation of the petrodollar, which resulted from the abandonment of the gold peg, as was the destruction of American small business in the recession of 1979 and 1983. I was in the Carter White House at the time. We saw Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve, suddenly, almost overnight, begin to raise interest rates. They eventually reached 20%. Jimmy Carter, the president of the U.S., was not even told they were going to do that. They created the recession that brought Reagan into power. The Reagan Revolution, so-called, turned the nation's economy over to Wall Street, followed by the key measure a decade later, whereby President Bill Clinton agreed to repeal the Glass-Steagall Act, through which commercial and investment banking had been kept separate for over half a century. So now Goldman Sachs, for instance, had access to fractional reserve banking and to trillion-dollar bank bailouts, and we know what happened there. The Main Street economy of the United States was wrecked in the late 70s and the 1980s. Wall Street and the banks gained the power to smash the economy, destroy the labor movement and the middle class, and gain obscene profits from the roller coaster of booms and busts that has terrorized our nation for the last several decades. All this was facilitated by the computer automation of banking and money transfer that has allowed the use of derivatives to store bank-generated wealth that they could not utilize by lending at interest. And I'll say a little bit more about that later, because this is a link that very few analysts have, well, they recognize it, but they haven't really told very many people about, where the derivatives money comes from. So that's my history lesson in a nutshell, and as you can tell, I have no slides or anything. I went to college in the 1960s, so this is a university lecture, but without the blackboard. Okay, so thank you. It's now time for the advocates of public banking and public control of credit and finance and money to fight back. And that's what you are doing, and I applaud you from the bottom of my heart. It shouldn't just be done at the state level, though it was Ellen's discovery of the state-operated Bank of North Dakota and telling that tremendous story which started a lot of this ball rolling. Public banking can also be done at the national level. It could be done through legislative changes that could make the U.S. Treasury a bank of issue, or by chartering a new public central bank to replace the Federal Reserve. There are many ways this can be done. Treasury could also issue federal payments directly for infrastructure, as was done with greenbacks. Or, and again, Bill talked about this, the American Monetary Institute and Congressman Dennis Kucinich, before he got gerrymandered out the door, had proposed. Or it could also issue a citizen's dividend instead of bank bailouts. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Okay. And it could also monetize local complementary currencies. Again, a topic few have talked about. So, what I want to suggest at this point, for those of you at this conference, expand your mind as much as possible about how money is created and distributed, what money is for, and then we ask, what is life for, why we exist, and what we intend to accomplish during our lifetime on this planet, and how all the spiritual traditions down through the ages call upon us to treat one another, because every major spiritual tradition has a golden rule, to treat others as we would have them treat us. There's no difference between our economic life, our social life, and our spiritual life. And we need to begin to act from the heart in that way. Thank you. So, now we're getting into the topic. 2 years ago, I was invited to address the annual meeting of the International Reciprocal Trading Association, known as IRTA, at Puerto Aventuras, Mexico, on the Yucatan Peninsula. My wife Karen joined me on this fascinating journey where we also visited ruins of the ancient Mayan civilization. We stayed in a luxurious, all-inclusive resort in the vicinity of dirt-poor towns where modern-day Mayans live in abject poverty today. So there couldn't have been a better example of the difference between the haves and the have-nots than what we saw in the Yucatan Peninsula. And it's repeated everywhere in the world, as we know, including our own cities. And I see it in my own hometown of Roanoke, Virginia now. This barrier between those who have and are afraid of losing what they have and those who have nothing and cannot get any more than what they do not have. So, at the IRTA conference, I made two proposals. The first had to do with promoting financial freedom for any organization, institution, or jurisdiction that creates an alternative or complementary currency, including bartering organizations which trade in the billions of dollars that set up a centralized exchange system to monetize the inventory of participating business entities. IRTA, for instance, has created a system called UC, or Universal Currency. It's a computer spreadsheet. It's money. It's a marvelous system. Here's the problem, though, which I explained at their conference. Those who understand alternative currencies are aware they are legal. They're completely legal under the Internal Revenue Code, so long as they are denominated in the equivalent to the US dollar, and so long as any person, business or individual, pays tax to IRS on any profits realized in the alternative currency. Right, you're all aware of that. If you make a profit off your alternative currency, Ithaca hours, for instance, you have to pay tax on that profit. But the tax must be paid in what? US dollars. This is totally wrong. I explained to IRTA that this regulation should be viewed as unconstitutional in terms of denying the person using UC or any other alternative currency the equal protection of the laws as spelled out in the Fifth Amendment. Go back and read the Fifth Amendment. Equal protection of the laws applies across the board to any provision of U.S. law. So I told IRTA they should immediately launch a lawsuit against IRS demanding that they be allowed to pay tax in their alternative currency, the one they have created based on the value of their commodities for purposes of trade. Again, billions of dollars in trade pass through this currency every year. Now, the argument you hear, oh, it'd be chaotic if anybody could invent a currency and pay taxes denominated in that currency. They say alternative currencies are not and can never be legal tender. What is legal tender? It's a totally arbitrary concept. Anything could be declared legal tender. Bottle caps could be declared legal tender if the law is passed. So why does it just apply to bank-created debt-based Federal Reserve notes? Why? Well, you may have noticed that any authoritarian gatekeeper uses as his first argument against liberty, it's chaotic. People doing what they want. Chaos. But a currency invented by barter association members is no different from a bank-invented currency. If it moves trade, it is a legitimate currency. If it moves trade, it's a medium of exchange. So, I can tell you, based on my own government experience, that it would be the easiest thing in the world for Treasury to convert currency received in other than US dollars into US dollars through a computer program. Such a provision would immediately bring about a huge increase in circulating currency at the grassroots level, sufficient to break the banking monopoly on money creation. So that's what I have to say about the tremendous movement going on in the world today. It's thousands of systems being set up of alternative currency. It's a legitimate attempt to create a circulating medium of exchange. So when I made this proposal, they gave me a standing ovation. That's all right. Don't have to stand. Because they realized the significance of what they had heard. So I would urge the Public Banking Institute, Dominican University, and anybody who's interested in this to research it and to consider the legal implications of what I'm saying here. Okay. Now, the second proposal to IRTA was for there to be established a worldwide basic income guarantee under the auspices of the UN or some other central authority, whereby a basic subsistence income would be paid to every adult on the planet. I call this the Gaia Plan. Gaia, Mother Earth. Earth taking care of her children, or us doing it with her. People throw up their hands in horror. One world government. Well, we know we have one world government already, namely the tyranny of the international banking cartel, which seeks to establish control over every nation on earth by monopolizing the issuance of currency. In fact, this cartel And this goes along with what Bill was saying again. You see, I'm keying off Bill. I've been following Bill's work for years. The attempt to create a gold standard internationally, the World Bank wants to do that. This is a big currency contraction. This is not increasing circulating currency for movement of trade. This is contracting the currency. And they are attempting to do that. And don't believe what I say. You go onto YouTube, they're telling us what they're doing. They are declaring an international currency contraction. That's why countries like Greece, like Spain, like Cyprus, like us, are increasingly in trouble at the working level because the currency is drying up. It isn't there. It's not an accident. It's not systemic. And it's not just the U.S. banking system or the Federal Reserve. It's the wealthy owners of the entire world financial system. And the way to break their power, which is really a power to commit selected genocide, I am a wordsmith, I don't use these words lightly, I mean what I say, is through measures like public banking, monetization of alternative currencies, and things like the Gaia Plan. This is the way, these measures, these systems are the way to break that terrible tyranny that is being exercised worldwide. Now, by way of disclosure, I am a member of the U.S. Basic Income Guarantee Network. It is a formal organization. I have addressed 2 of that organization's national conventions. Members of that network believe that as a matter of justice and economic policy, every person in society, and it's often expressed as every adult, should receive a free and unencumbered stipend sufficient to sustain the basic requirements of life. We believe the stipend should be granted regardless of employment status and without any means test. We view it as a fundamental human right. An example of such an initiative on a limited scale is the Alaska Permanent Fund, which many of you know about. Once a year, every Alaska resident receives a check annually as that person's share of the state's resource revenues. The nation furthest along to implementing a basic income guarantee is Brazil. And I believe that the previous speaker, speaking of the Brazilian family grants, is talking about that millions of Brazilian women have as their only source of income. Similar proposals and studies are underway in Italy, Finland, the state of Oregon, and elsewhere. And I just learned about this next thing recently. There are petitions today circulating among the nations of the European Union. If they get 1 million signatures within the next several months, the EU Parliament must put this on their agenda for formal analysis and debate. So there's a major movement going on across Europe now for a basic income guaranteed subsistence level payment to every citizen of the European Union. So this movement is big and it's growing. And we know that the idea of a basic income guarantee also has deep roots in the world's spiritual traditions as well as in our concept of citizenship. The idea that without bank-originated money, you live on the street, starve and die, is very much a modern innovation of our materialistic cultures. Now, I do have to say that the Gaia Plan counters the idea that the only way to save the economy is for more and more jobs to be created. It's a strong prejudice and a hard mental habit to break. Terry McAuliffe, who was one of Bill Clinton's principal handlers in the 1990s, is now running for governor of Virginia. And I went to where they were setting up a rally for Terry McAuliffe in Roanoke. Poster after poster, jobs, 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 jobs. What a slogan, what an easy thing to say. The fact is that technology is constantly eliminating jobs by making work more productive. More and more jobs are being eliminated all the time. And there are experts who estimate that by the year 2030, half of all current jobs will be gone. So where's the purchasing power going to come from? Okay, thank you. Almost done. So why don't people realize this is a good thing? This is an actual real-time appreciation of the value of the world economy. It means that the leisure dividend, which we once thought held great promise, but has proved an impossible dream, would actually become possible. The desirability of a leisure dividend was first enunciated clearly over a century ago by somebody you probably heard of. His name was Nikola Tesla. This was advocated in the 1960s. The guru of conservative economics, Milton Friedman, came out strongly in the 60s for the reverse income tax. Dr. Martin Luther King argued for it. Daniel Patrick Moynihan argued for it. Richard Nixon argued for it, and it was defeated in the Senate by a coalition of Southern senators. Now, I'm going to stop here. I got more, but you can read it in the book, and you can take a look at the whole issue of where is money going to come from, because as you know, that's the first thing the Tea Party says. Where's the money going to come from? We're broke. The government's in debt. There's no money. Nonsense. Nonsense. Have you seen over and over again, money as a public utility has endless potential to monetize real work, real economic activity, and the needs of real people. Again, that's how they got the $600 trillion in derivatives. They created it out of thin air. They can't lend it because nobody can repay that amount of money. They got it through shuffling money through the electronic transfer system that I was part of developing at Treasury starting in 1986. So let me just close by saying, I would like to call your attention today to my proposal for the Gaia Plan. There are many other similar plans circulating, because I think if you really think about it, you will see that the Gaia Plan helps provide a spiritual solution to the problem as well as a financial solution, along with all the other great ideas coming out of meetings like this. Don't ever say it can't be done or it won't be done. Because when I look at the tremendous changes in consciousness that have taken place in the world in the last few years, since I got out of the government, not only in the financial area, but in every other area, things are moving so fast that things today we think can't or won't be done are going to be done, because they have to be done. The system we have today is destroying the world we live in. It's up to us to create and implement the alternatives and to do it without fear. Thank you.